everything looks good. Okay. So this is take 2 on the tips. Okay, stand by, please. Let me just get your focus. Okay.
Now I'm going to give you some parenting tips on raising a child who has autism from my 35 years of being in the teaching field and working with special needs children.
Great.
Okay. Just keep going.
All right.
Just keep rolling through them.
All right. So I'm now going to ask you about if the pediatrician or the doctor says wait and see, and that's why this is also called the Act Early program. So the old wait and see, we're trying, this is really
Right.
for parents who, with the little ones.
Mm-hmm. And they love when doctors say that.
Exactly, and we know they do.
Yes, we do.
So if a child is showing significant delays or has been screened at risk, what is your advice about working with the child's pediatrician or doctor if that person says wait and see?
One of the big concerns that we have as a school is the number of physicians who have a wait and see kind of attitude. It's that they don't want to give a child a diagnosis until they're 5 or 7 or 8. There's always this kind of wait. And as I tell parents, I said, I don't care what you're diagnosed with, but the only way that you can get services covered is if you have that diagnosis. So, and the earlier that you get that diagnosis, the earlier that you can start services. And so I would encourage doctors to look at the fact of early intervention being necessary for a great outcome. And we see that day in and day out when we start our kids at 1 and 2 working with their developmental delays. By the time they're in kindergarten, we have a child who can function in a regular classroom because we started that. And when you don't get that diagnosis early, there's a lot of years. There's 5 incredible developmental years that have been wasted because you've not attended to the needs, to making sure that they're meeting their developmental milestones, to make sure that they're moving forward. And they also have a lot of time to instill inappropriate behaviors because they've not been dealt with, because we're just waiting and see. So as a parent, I would encourage parents, if you don't get an answer, if you get a wait and see, you maybe need to look at a different physician who is willing to take a chance on a diagnosis so that you can get services.
Great. Okay, next question, and I don't know the answer to this. Interested to see what you have to say.
Ooh, the stakes are high.
Right, it's set up there. So what happens if a child is showing delays and they have a risk, but there's a long wait list for a diagnosis? And part of what we're doing here in working with some of the BCBAs is showing parents the basic skills around reinforcement and pairing and managing behavior. So that's one thing, is that there are enrichment skills that they can do, but what would you say to a parent, or what should a parent do if a child is showing significant delays or has been screened at risk and there's a long wait list for a diagnosis?
And there is.
Right, there is.
So frequently what we find out is that psychologists, psychiatrists are backed up for months. So you may be looking at 6 months before you can get your child in to get an official diagnosis, even though as a parent something is not right. The school has told you something is not right if they're in a preschool. And so what we would suggest that you do is we would suggest, first of all, that you look to early steps, which I believe all states have them. So I would suggest that you start looking at early steps to get services from them, because if there is a developmental delay, they're going to detect it. And if they're 3, then that you look into your local school board and start the process of getting them an individualized education program, which will also provide them services. And then if you can find a preschool that provides services or provides additional training to their staff, that would be ideal. But I know that is, those are few and far between to come upon that. And so the other thing that I would strongly suggest is that you pair yourself up with parents who have children who have disabilities also. So there's support groups in a lot of areas. And so if you can find a support group, even if you don't have a diagnosis, those parents who have gone before you are a great source of getting through the daily task. How do you deal with this? What are the services that are available? So whenever you can find a support service until you get that professional who will give you a diagnosis, who will lead you to services that your insurance will cover, find a group, find a parent group, find a caring teacher, a teacher that has a passion for children. So a special ed teacher may be of use. You got to do your homework. You've really have to get out there and find that group of people that is going to help to support you and help to give you some hints until you can get professional help.
Great.
Stand over there because she keeps looking at you.
Okay. I'll stand over here.
Sorry.
Well, and maybe the answer is similar, but sort of moving down the experience spectrum. If they do have a diagnosis, but they're on a long wait list for therapy services, maybe this sort of the same answer. But what would your thoughts be then?
If you are waiting on therapy services, because there is, especially if you're waiting on an ABA therapist, there's a shortage of speech therapists. There's a shortage of insurance coverage for some families. So again, it's the same thing. You have to be that bulldog parent that is determined to find a solution, and you've got to find in your community or close to your community somebody that can help you. Or you go to the library and you start reading, or you look on the internet and you begin to find solutions. And I think the making of this video is one of the first steps, that they're actually going to be giving you clues as to how to handle common concerns until you get help. And it is shortage of services is shortage of paid services. Even if you can find a therapist to take you, getting it covered by insurance is another battle. And I just, as a parent of a special needs child and as a administrator of a special needs school, I can tell you that the hard work that you do now pays off for your child in the long run, and it also paves the way for future parents who are going to have the same battle that you do.
Great. Could you briefly explain the difference between ABA therapy, speech therapy, and occupational therapy?
Okay. Ooh, that's a tough one. Okay. Types of therapy. The most common that we find that are useful is obviously speech therapy. And a lot of parents go, well, my kid speaks fine. And they do. A lot of times speech therapy is more about the mechanics. Speech therapy also covers like eating disorders. So we tend to think, oh, it's just about speech. But if your child is having an eating disorder, speech therapists will work through that. If they have textural issues, so that's your speech therapy aspect covers so much more than just how you pronounce a T or an M or an S. The occupational therapy is a little bit different. It will work with how your body functions in space. So we think of occupational therapy if your child has a hard time holding a pencil or riding a bike or something, and those are things that occupational therapy will also work on. But more than that, if your child has sensory issues, Like if they're, one of the things we see a lot of times as kids, they're like walking against a wall. They're always leaning on a wall or walking against a wall. That's something that an occupational therapist can help with, because they're just looking to define their place in space. And so the occupational therapist will help kids to define their place in space, and to begin to do those functional things that we need. So it also works with toothbrushing and handwriting and bike riding and swimming, and it's really encompasses a lot that we don't really think about. When we think about occupational therapy, we tend to think of bathing yourself or some functional skills, which it does cover that also, but it covers so much more than that. And then the ABA therapy is probably the greatest gain that we've had, and we've been fortunate as a school to bring ABA therapists into our school, and our parents are using those, and significant difference in behavior. And when I say behavior, I don't want you to look at that as just negative behaviors. So they do help control. If your child has a negative behavior, they will help to eliminate those. But they also work on putting in place needed behaviors. So like social skills, like helping them to socialize with other kids in their classroom, helping them to sit through a lesson, helping them to pay attention to things that are going on, helping them to deal with the environmental input that they get. So if the classroom is too loud or too bright or too many kids, or the ABA therapist comes alongside that child and helps them to learn skills that deal with those behaviors. So they help them to function in daily life using behavioral techniques, behavioral theory behind that. And probably of all the therapies, that has been the most effective therapy. And the really great thing is that parents can learn to do a lot of those. It's really hard because you don't always have a pure environment to work in. But if you get a hold of a good ABA therapist, they will train you how to do these things in your home, and which becomes necessary. It's one thing to do it in isolation of a therapy center or a classroom. It's another thing when they come home, how do I control this behavior too when I have one or two other children running around, or I'm trying to make dinner, or I'm trying to cook. There's just things that they know about behavior that makes the task of raising a child with autism so much easier.
That was very helpful. Thank you. So following up on that point, how can parents evaluate the quality of a therapist? What do they look for especially in finding an ABA therapist? And how do they know if their child is making proper progress?
Ooh. Okay, I gotta think about that one a little bit.
Sure. Take your time.
I guess if you've been able to find a therapist, I think at times some of parents just take whomever they can find, and because there is a shortage. Our therapy companies that we work with are continually trying to find therapists to come on board and work with our children, and there are other children outside of our center that they work with also. So that I think at times we do that, but you also don't want them to do unnecessary harm to your child. So you have to be an attentive parent, and you have to take note of any behavioral changes that would be perceived as negative. And you have to be cautious, because sometimes negative behaviors that show up are possibly because they have extinguished other inappropriate behaviors and now they're being replaced. So you really have to get to know, you have to develop a relationship with that therapist. You have to be able to talk with them. You have to feel like they're answering your questions. You need a therapist that will talk with your child's teachers and other professionals that are in their life. So the therapist should be talking to each other, because what we demand in our center is that if you're coming onto our campus to work with one of our kids, you have to tell us your plan. Otherwise, we can be unknowingly undoing all of your hard work. And so, as a parent, you just need to make sure that all the cogs, all the wheels are clicking together as they should be. And if you get that sense, there's a lot to be said from that inner discernment, that gut, something is wrong. And as a parent, you have to trust that. Unfortunately, at times it's hard, because you may not have many choices as to who's doing your therapy. But you just need to make sure that your child is progressing, and your therapist should be giving you notes. They should be giving you progress reports, that this is what we've seen, this is the behavior that we've eradicated, and this is the behavior that we've improved on. Your child is now eating different foods, where before they maybe ate one food and now we're eating 5 foods. So you have to, communication with your therapist is paramount in making sure that your child is getting the needed services. And if you at any point feel like something is wrong, trust your instinct and move on to somebody else.
Wow, great advice, Terry, thank you. So on the subject,
Let's give Terry a break real quick.